Hi, and welcome to another episode of pianoTV. So today we are going to tackle a long-standing request to do a history video on the composer Charles Valentin Alkan. Now, Alkan was a composer in the Romantic period. He was French, he was Jewish, and he was friends with guys like Franz Liszt and Chopin. But he is not nearly as famous as Liszt and Chopin. I mean, you might not have even heard his name before. So what we're going to talk about today is his life, and we're also going to postulate on why he isn't as famous. Just like do a little speculation. So let's get started. Charles Alkan was born in 1813 in Paris to a very musical family. Charles Alkan's dad was a musician by trade, and he also started a private musical school later in life. And he also had 5 siblings who were equally musical, although Charles Alkan is the most well-known of them. There was like a flute player, and there were piano players, and composers, and like teachers, and like every single one of the siblings had musical talent. And like many other famous composers, Charles Alkan was a child prodigy. At the age of 7, he auditioned for the Paris Conservatoire on the piano, and one of the comments that the examiner wrote is, "This child has amazing abilities." And we all know how tough the examiners are. He wrote his first Opus 1 piano composition set when he was just 14 years old, and that's like, he was already starting to get serious at that age. When he was a teenager, he was performing all over Paris at salons, which were basically just like fancy rich people parties. He was helping his dad teach over at his dad's music school, and he was continuing his own studies. So I mean, like the work ethic kids had back in the day, right? Later in Charles's teenage years, he began integrating even more strongly into Paris's music arts scene and became acquainted with people like George Sand. George Sand was a writer, and also Chopin's paramour, and Franz Liszt. They were all like late teenagers, early 20s when they met each other. Same with Chopin. So Charles Alkan met Chopin in 1832 when he was like around 20 years old, and they became fast friends. Charles continued writing and performing throughout his early 20s all across Paris, and he became pretty well known for it too. He was living at the Square d'Orléans, which is basically like an apartment block for famous people. Like Chopin lived there, and that's how they deepened their friendship. They got to see each other a lot and hang out, all that stuff. But in 1839, everything changed for Charles Alkan. He went on his first retreat from the public life. So a couple things happened to cause this. The first thing that happened was he had a son. His son's name was Élie Myriam Delaborde, and let's just say that Delaborde was not a natural-born son. He was an illegitimate child to a wealthy piano student of Charles Alkan's. But let us say no more of this. I mean, honestly, it was Paris in the 1800s. It's not like no one had ever had an illegitimate child before, but Alkan took it pretty hard. Like, he was a pretty old-fashioned, strongly moral man. The birth of his son can't be blamed for all of the reasons that Charles Alkan went into seclusion, though, even though it's clearly a pretty big part of it. Another part of it, though, was that Charles Alkan was pretty unhappy with the musical situation in Paris in 1839. It was kind of like all glam and bombast, and everyone was trying to outstage each other and outplay each other, and that just wasn't his scene. Even on Alkan's best days, he was a traditionalist at heart, and he wasn't really a big fan of modern music, so it just made him angry. So in the early 1840s, Charles moved away from the Square d'Orléans, which meant that him and Chopin weren't living in the same place anymore, which means they just started communicating by letters and through friends. Hey, if you see Chopin, tell him that I think he's awesome. And I mean, they kept missing each other at social functions too, because Chopin was frail and he got sick a lot, so Alkan would be somewhere and Chopin would be sick. And then Chopin would be somewhere and Alkan would be reclusive. So I mean, hashtag introvert life. But in 1844, it's Alkan saw the light and he decided I'm gonna come back out into the spotlight and do stuff again. So he started performing, and he got a lot of good critical accolades because he was really good. He had basically spent 5 years training his technique, and the critics noted the admirable perfection of his piano playing. He also started teaching his young 5-year-old son piano lessons, and his son was destined to become a great performer and virtuoso, just like his father. So that was nice. Good guy. So I mean, life was good for him. Again, people were starting to remember who he was, but unfortunately, this sort of revival in the public eye was pretty short-lived. Within 6 years or so, he he'd be going back into another like seclusion from society, and a lot longer of one. The time was 1848, and things were tough for the average musician in Paris. There was the Paris Revolution, so musicians were like booking it, and there wasn't a lot of like performance opportunities for a musician, so it's a little harder to make money. But Alkan, he wasn't going to leave. Instead, he was gunning for the post of the head of the Paris Conservatoire, and he was very, very passionate about getting this post partly because he wanted to improve his financial situation, but he was also like a passionate musician and teacher, and he was like definitely well qualified for the post. But he had a rival, and his rival was Antoine Marmontel, who ended up getting the post. I mean, spoiler alert. But Charles Alkan was like pretty scathing of this guy. Like, he was like, he's mediocre, he doesn't know how to teach, he's a crappy musician. Like, he wasn't a very good piano player, granted. And Charles Alkan was almost definitely better qualified, but politics, sometimes, you know, people pull strings, there's biases. So for one reason or another, Charles Alkan didn't get the post, and he was like traumatized by that. And just to further compound his trauma and despair, Chopin died the next year in 1849 and lost a good friend. So in a letter that he wrote to one of his friends, he said, "I have lost the strength to be of any economic or political use." So by 1854, Charles had pretty much entirely disappeared from the public eye again, this time all the way until 1873. So like a 20-year period of just like not performing. Like, he just pieced right out. He didn't give up on being a musician. He was still doing a lot of writing. He just wasn't doing performing. And there's not a lot that people know about this time period for Alkan, but we do have like little bits and pieces from letters that he was sending back and forth to friends. So one thing that we knew about him was that he had a very like foul view of modern music. He threw barbs at everyone from Liszt to Berlioz, and especially to Wagner. Like, Alkan hated Wagner. Like, one of his quotes about him was that Wagner was not a musician, but a sickness. Like, whoa. Getting a little out of control there, Alkan. Another way that Alkan was passing the time in this 20-year time span is he became very dedicated to translating into French the entire Old Testament and New Testament from its original language. So this is a guy that was like really like, he just went all in. Like, he went hard. So flashing forward to the 1860s, and Charles Alkan was slowly sinking into poverty, and his mental illness got a little iffy there, and I think that's just mainly because of being secluded from society. Or it can work the other way around, like, you have a mental illness and then you withdraw and then it exacerbates it. He eventually even gave up on composing music because he just couldn't see the points of it anymore. Like, this was a pretty rough time in his life. And then moving closer to 1870, Paris was even more upheaval. Germany was attacking it, people were leaving. Even Charles Alkan's son, who was by this point a famous, well-known composer and performer, had left the city for a little bit. But our Charles Alkan, he was never leaving Paris. Like, it didn't even matter. Like, his apartment had bullet holes in it, and he just kept on living in Paris. Finally, in 1873, Charles Alkan decided, like, enough is enough. I'm tired of being secluded from society, and he started performing again and putting himself out there. The famous Vincent d'Indy commented on Alkan's playing, saying that his performance of Bach showed expressive, crystal clear playing. He also commented on Alkan's Opus 110 Beethoven Sonata performance, saying, "It wasn't Liszt, like perhaps less perfect technically, but it had greater intimacy and was more humanly moving." So that just gives us a little bit of insight into the style of Alkan's playing. And that brings us to his death in 1888. I know that's like jumping ahead 14 years, but that, like, when I was researching him, that's basically like, he performed a lot, he like got back into the public scene, and then he died. He lived to the old age of 74, which is like pretty good for the time. Like, it was a time where guys like Chopin only lived till age 39, so like that's a pretty good accomplishment. For some reason, the fable of his death is that a bookcase toppled over on him when he was reaching for some religious book, but totally didn't happen that way. Apparently, he was discovered in his apartment, trapped underneath like a heavy coat rack in his kitchen, and then he died a few hours after they found him. And I mean, that's all the details I was able to discover. I mean, it could have been anything, like maybe he broke a hip or something, I don't know. So let's talk about the complicated topic of Alkan's personality. Now, there's always someone saying that every composer ever had some mental illness or other, so I don't necessarily believe that Alkan had a mental illness, but it's been speculated that he might have had Asperger's or OCD. Like, I have no idea. but just sharing the info with you guys. But what we do know is that Alkan was definitely like a full throttle, all in kind of guy. I mean, the fact that he translated the entire Bible is pretty much a testament to that. Also, his amazing piano technique, like it was so well developed, like he clearly dedicated his life to music. And his technique was actually so good that Liszt considered him to be his only true rival. Like Charles Alkan was the only person who made Liszt sweat a little when he performed. His relationship with his son is also pretty interesting. I mean, he never openly admitted that Delaborde was his son, but like everyone knew. I get a feeling that their personal relationship with each other was fairly tense, but at the end of the day, they seemed to have a strong mutual respect for each other. And there did seem to be love in there too. I mean, Charles's son was always welcome at his house, even if they did have a bit of tension, and they performed together. And even after Alkan died, his son Delaborde was like still performing his dad's music and keeping it in the public ear. I mean, Alkan was a traditionalist, so there was probably a really big part of him that was super ashamed about Delaborde's entire existence. But I mean, he was also an overall decent guy who wanted to help out his son, so he probably just had these these two conflicting personality traits, like being a good guy, being like opposed to having illegitimate children and being dishonorable. Alkan's traditionalist streak also set him apart from his contemporaries who were very like flashy and fabulous. Like he was definitely like in everything, like his manner, the way he dressed, he was very old fashioned, and he really liked older music like Baroque and classical music, wasn't a fan of music of the time. So he was just like, he was a man from after his time. Charles Alkan was also one of the first people to put Jewish themes and ideas into art music, like his Opus 31 collection of preludes. He also became infatuated with a musical instrument called the pedalier, and he wrote a lot of pieces for it, but the pedalier it's an obsolete instrument, so there's like an entire body of music of his that's basically just like irrelevant. Interestingly, there are only 2 known portraits of Charles Alkan, so I mean, one's a picture from behind, so I just... my editor's shaking his fist right now at that. I know it. After Charles Alkan's lifetime, he basically disappeared into obscurity until the 1960s, where some dedicated performers decided to bring his music back into repertoire and rotation. I think the main reason that he's less famous than guys like Chopin and Liszt is because of his periods of seclusion, because he went into his first period of seclusion when he was 26 years old. Before that, he had been building his career, becoming more and more well-known, but kind of like when he was like, before he ever really broke through that and became, I guess, like really famous, exploded in popularity, that's when he pulled back and went into, like, he withdrew from society. And then the same thing happened again when he had his like second wind in between his first and second retreats from performing. He like started to become well known again, and then he pulled back before he like exploded in popularity. So I think that that's probably the main reason he's not as well known as people like Chopin and Liszt today, because by all other accounts he was just as talented and just as skilled. I think part of it might also have something to do with the fact that he just like pretty much never left Paris, and a lot of other musicians would go on tours to other countries and kind of like spread their name that way, but he didn't. I mean, this is just me speculating though. Like, I'd love to know why you think Charles Alkan was, you know, he kind of disappeared from public knowledge, but that's what I would think would be like the main reasons. That is all for today's video on Charles Alkan. Hopefully you learned something. I know that I did. Before doing this video, I actually spent quite a bit of time reading about him, because I didn't know much about him to begin with, because he's not one of the more famous people that, you know, that you study when you're doing exams and stuff like that. But I'm really glad that I did. He's an interesting dude, and it's given me a deeper appreciation for his music. So hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you have any questions or comments, or if you have any request ideas, be sure to leave it in the comments area below, and I will catch you guys next time. The first thing that happened was he had a son, and his son's name was... Quiet phone.